All right, time for Chapter 5. So Chapter 5 moves up our level of hierarchy. So we started off in Chapter 2 with atoms and moving to molecules. And then Chapter 4 doing the organelles as well as the next level, the full cell. Now we'll look at tissues. So that's your grouping of the same type of cell and how some of these tissues also work together to form membranes. So in the human body, there's about 50 trillion cells, and of those 50 trillion cells, there's about 200 different cell types. So these cells make up tissues that are looped or grouped into 4 different categories. So each of these different categories can work together to form an organ. So your organs, a lot of them are made of multiple tissue types. In order to study them, we usually do this using microscopy. So we'll take our tissue, we'll slice it really thin, stain it so we can see all our little pieces and parts of the cells and other structures that make up the tissue, and that way we're able to see the microscopic differences in our different tissue types. So a tissue is a group of similar cells, and they perform a specific role in an organ. There's 4 different tissue types. So we have epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscular tissue, and they all differ from each other in the types of cells that make them up and the functions of those cells. What's inside their matrix, so what's on the outside of the cells, so the extracellular components of those tissues, and how much space is occupied by the cells versus in the matrix. So some tissues, they have very closely tight-packed cells, and then some tissues, for example, your connective tissues, these cells are way more spread out, and so there's a lot more matrix in those types of tissues. So in this matrix, there's different components. You have fibrous proteins. You also have a clear gel called a ground substance. This ground substance, also known as tissue fluid, extracellular fluid, or interstitial fluid, or tissue gel. So in order to make our tissues, we need a bunch of cells. So we start off as a fertilized egg, which then later grows and multiplies into additional cells to form an embryo with 3 major tissue layers. So there's 3 germ layers in an embryo. You have the ectoderm, which is on the outer layer of the embryo, and it gives rise to our epidermis and our nervous system. So the cells that make up this germ layer are going to form our skin and our nervous system, so our brains and all the nerves associated with that. Next layer is the endoderm. It's the inner layer. So endo, inner, ecto is outer. So this layer will eventually develop into the mucous membrane lining for the digestive and respiratory tract. So both of these will be exposed to the outside environment. So again, more internal, being surrounded by the rest components of our body. Our digestive glands, so again, part of your digestive system. And then the last germ layer is the mesoderm, so it's the middle layer. So if we have our 3 layers, so we have on the outside our ectoderm, on the inside the endoderm, and then in the middle is the mesoderm. So the middle mesoderm becomes what's called the mesenchyme, and the mesoderm is made up of these wispy collagen fibers as well as fibroblasts. And this layer will eventually become cartilage and bone to make up our skeletal system, as well as our blood. So our first major tissue type is the epithelial tissue. For your epithelial tissue, the cells are closely adhering. They're sheets of tissue, so they lie right on top of each other. There's usually at least 1 layer. There's also can have multiple layers where they're stacked on top of each other. This type of tissue usually covers our body surfaces on the outside and lines body cavities on the inside. So for example, in the vagina, inside of your, for example, your respiratory tract and your digestive tract. This epithelial tissue has a lot of glands located in there, and also it does not have blood vessels. So in order for this tissue, the cells there, to get the nutrients that they need, it has to be nourished by an underlying connective tissue. So you'll have your epithelial tissue, and then a basement membrane, and underneath that is your connective tissue. So the functions of the epithelial tissue, remembering that it's on the lining of our body cavities as well as on the outside of the body. So protecting our deeper tissues from injury and infection, producing and releasing chemical secretions, so both on the outside surface of our skin and on the inside. So for example, our gastric juices to break down food, to excrete waste, as well as absorb chemicals, including nutrients, so more so our digestive system. Selectively filter out substances, so a lot of our epithelial tissues are thin and one layer, and things are able to absorb through that epithelial tissue. And then lastly, able to sense stimuli, so particularly the epithelial tissue that makes up the skin senses stimuli. So the epithelial tissue has a high rate of mitosis, so continuously always making new cells, because the epithelial tissue is in an area where they're exposed to the outside environment, and so it's more likely to get damaged, and so you need to replace those cells. Underlying a epithelial tissue layer is always going to be a basement membrane, so that helps to line the cells of that epithelial tissue. And below, or either a more deeper structure, deeper tissue than that basement membrane. So we have our epithelial tissue on the outside, basement membrane, and then more deeper is the connective tissue layer. So again, the connective tissue layer has the blood vessels with the nutrients to help support the epithelial tissue above it. So there's two surfaces of the cells in an epithelial tissue. So the part of the cell, so even if you have multiple layers, the side of the cell that is facing towards the basement membrane is the basal surface. The other side is the apical surface, so facing away from the basement membrane. There's two types of epithelial tissue. You have simple epithelial tissue and stratified epithelial. With your simple epithelial, there's only one layer of cells. With stratified, there's at least two layers, so it has to be two or more layers to be stratified. So again, stratified being layered on top of each other. For simple epithelial, all the cells will touch the basement membrane. So again, so it's only one layer. So here, let's zoom this in. We have our basement membrane. There we go. Here, kind of this little fuzzy brown color, and then our one layer of cells on top of it. So all of these are touching the basement membrane. For our stratified epithelial, only one layer is going to touch the basement membrane. So there's going to be some cells that are on top of other cells. Since the pictures here, I'm going to keep going with our little pictures. So we have, again, our classes. We have our simple, so one layer, our stratified, which is multiple layers, so touching on top of each other. And then this very unique layer called the pseudostratified columnar. So it looks like there's possibly multiple layers. However, in this layer, there's actually, in this tissue type, there's actually only one layer of cells. So all the cells will touch the basement membrane, even though they look like they're kind of stacked on top of each other, particularly, for example, this cell here, where you almost can't tell that it's touching the basement membrane. Actually, all of the cells will touch the basement membrane. So with both of these tissue types, they have differences in the shapes that make up those tissues. So there's squamous, so our little flat egg-shaped cells. So this is kind of like the side view, and this is more like a closer, slightly tilted 3D view. Are cuboidal, so equally as wide as it is as tall, and then columnar, where it's more tall than it is wide. So there's 4 types on our simple epithelial. So our epithelial tissue that only has 1 layer. So again, we have our different shapes with squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and our pseudostratified columnar, where again it looks like they're stratified, where they're stacked on top of each other, but in fact all of the cells will touch the basement membrane. So in some of these tissues, there's a special cell called a goblet cell. It looks like a wine glass, therefore getting its name of goblet. Usually this cell creates a mucus. So with these epithelial tissue lining, for example, our body cavities that are exposed to the outside environment, the mucus helps to protect those tissues. So these goblet cells will make this mucus, and they're located in either simple columnar or pseudostratified epithelial tissue. Our next type is our stratified epithelial. So again, to be stratified or having multiple layers, so at least 2 layers, can have 20 or more layers of cell, just depending on the tissue types. So in our stratified epithelial, only the deepest layer is going to attach to the basement membrane, and then the rest of the cells will stack on top of them. So again, we still have our 3 different shapes, our squamous, our cuboidal, and our stratified columnar, which is a rare tissue type. The 4th type is a transitional epithelial. So that one's typically found in the urinary bladder. So with this transitional epithelial tissue, unlike your other stratified epithelial, this tissue, instead of these cells becoming smaller and smaller as you go away from the basement membrane, these cells become larger as you go through the basement membrane. That's to allow them to be able to stretch. So for example, as your bladder fills with urine, your bladder needs to be able to stretch to accommodate the filling of the bladder with urine. So the larger cells allow it to stretch when that organ is being filled. So stratified epithelial is the most widespread epithelium in the body, partially because our skin tissue, the epidermis, is stratified epithelial tissue. So, of course, covering all around the body, so very widespread. For our stratified epithelial, our newest cells are created in the deeper layers of the tissue. And then as the new cells, or our daughter cells, once they're born, they'll push up the older cells, and the older cells will flatten or become smaller as they migrate upward, except for our transitional epithelial. The larger cells are up top. So there's 2 kinds of stratified squamous epithelial. You have your keratinized, which is found on the skin surface. So there's a keratin protein that helps to strengthen the tissue to make it abrasion resistant, or resistant to being cut or rubbed off. And then the other type is your non-keratinized. So it lacks the layer of dead cells. So with your keratinized, as the cells are strengthened, the tissue is strengthened at the top, those cells are less likely to again be rubbed off or flaked off, and so there's a layer of dead cells that once they, instead of dying and flaking off, they just die and stay there because of the keratin helps to keep the tissue together. So I wanted to show you the transitional epithelial tissue and just how different it looks. Of course, I want you also to look at the other pictures throughout the PowerPoint, but I was just pointing out specifically this one. So here is the basement membrane for our transitional epithelial tissue. And then here we have our newer cells that are a little bit smaller. And as you move up in the layers on this tissue, the cells become larger and larger. So again, this allows for this tissue type to stretch as it gets filled. Our next major broad category of tissue are our connective tissues. So a lot of our connective tissues are below the basement membrane of epithelial tissue and will support that epithelial tissue. So having a lot of blood vessels so the epithelial tissue nutrients can diffuse from the connective tissue layer and up into the epithelial tissue. So there's different types of connective tissues. Most of the cells do not touch each other. They're actually widely spaced out. A lot of your connective tissues either supports, connects, or protects different organs. And again, having various degrees of what's called vascularity, or how many blood vessels are there. So for example, there's a lot of blood vessels in the dermis layer of skin, which is the connective tissue underneath your epidermis, epithelial tissue. That has a lot of blood vessels. Another connective tissue that has no blood vessels, or very, very few, is the cartilage that sits between your different bones. So varying degrees of how many blood vessels or vascularity there is, but still their job is to support and protect. So some of the functions of your connective tissue are to connect your organs. So you have tendons that connect muscle to bone, ligaments connect bone to bone. They help to support, so with our bones are a type of connective tissue, and the cartilage helps to support and protect the bones. Involved with physical protection, so bones making up our cranium or our skull, the ribs protecting cranium protecting our brain, ribs protecting our lungs, heart, and some of our upper abdomen organs, and the sternum, which is located on the middle part of the ribs, that breastbone plate helps to protect our heart. They're involved with immune protection, so the white blood cells that are made inside the bones help with our immune system. Our bones provide the levers for movement, so as the muscles contract, they'll pull on the bones in order to cause movement. They help with storage, so our adipocytes, or our fat tissue cells, they'll store our triglycerides, calcium stored in bone, phosphorus stored in bone. Necessary for heat production, so in infants, they have a particular type of fat called brown fat, so when it's metabolized or broken apart, that brown fat ends up releasing heat. And then the last job of our connective tissue is for transport. So blood is considered a connective tissue because you have these loosely spaced cells with a lot of matrix or the plasma in between them. And its job, again, is to transport nutrients to the tissues and pick up waste products. So there's different cells that make up our connective tissue. So first, focusing on the fibrous connective tissue. So what makes this cell what's called fibrous are our fibroblasts. So our blast cells, regardless of the tissue types, are going to be some kind of builder cell. So they're going to make more of that connective tissue. So we'll see specialized blast builder cells in two more tissue types that are in this connective category. So going back to our basic fibroblasts, they create the fibers as well as the ground substance for the matrix, so it helps to provide the scaffold or supporting structure for this tissue. Also in your fibrous connective tissue are macrophages. So macrophages are a type of immune cell that once they're migrating through our loosely organized connective tissue, gives it space to move around. And once these macrophages detect or come in contact with some kind of pathogen or foreign cell or foreign debris, so basically realizing that glycocalyx on the outside surface doesn't match the glycocalyx of the cells that should normally be in that body, they will phagocytize them, so they will eat up that foreign matter, take it inside the cell, and then help to break that up. Other cells are leukocytes, so a type of white blood cells, again helping with our immune system. The plasma cells, part of our immune system to make antibodies, which are a type of protein against a particular pathogen. So once they encounter a specific one, they make a specific protection against that particular pathogen. We have mast cells, which are found near our blood vessels, down here. They help with the function of your blood vessels, so secreting heparin to inhibit clotting, so prevent your blood vessels from clotting. Again, part of our immune system response, as well as secreting histamine to cause the blood vessels to dilate or become larger in its diameter. Last type of cell for fibrous connective tissue are our adipocytes. So these are our fat cells that store the triglycerides, which are our lipid storage molecules for the body. So inside our fibrous connective tissues, there's multiple types of fibers. So we have our collagenous fibers. This collagenous fibers are made of collagen. This collagen is a type of protein. It's very tough and flexible and stretch resistant. This fiber is found in our tendons and ligaments. So as you stretch and move, this connective tissue that makes up the tendons and ligaments are able to move with you. In the cartilage and bone, they're less visible in the matrix of them, but again, it's partially also due to their structure and how they're made because they're more like condensed and stronger than just regular fibrous connective tissue. Next type of fiber are your reticular fibers. They're a thin type of collagen fibers. So you have your collagen fibers, and then they're coated with what's called your glycoprotein. So this is a conjugated molecule, part protein and part carbohydrate chain. And they help with structure, forming the spleen and lymph nodes, so giving it those two structures their shape. And the last type of fiber are our elastic fibers. They're thinner than the collagenous fibers. These fibers will branch off and then rejoin each other to help form a kind of stretchy network. The protein for them is called elastin, and again allows things to stretch and recoil. Okay, last thing about our fibrous connective tissue is the ground substance. So again, the ground substance fills in the spaces between the fibers that make up the matrix, as well as between the cells that make up that connective tissue. So usually in fibrous connective tissue, the ground substance is gelatinous or rubbery, and that's due to this conjugated molecule called a glycoaminoglycans. So this glycoaminoglycans, or GAG for short, so we'll see that a few more times, is part carbohydrate, part protein. These GAGs help to regulate water as well as electrolyte balance, so exchange with air. The most abundant one is chondroitin sulfate, so you've seen this probably in the vitamin section at the grocery store, where they actually sell this molecule by itself. It's necessary for the stiffness in cartilage. However, if you take chondroitin sulfate into your body, your stomach, as well as the rest of your digestive system, is going to break down that molecule. So when it breaks it down, it's going to break it down into its different components, and therefore is no longer able to be effective as what you're hoping for to help your joints. It's by the time your digestive system gets through with it, it's just basically down into its basic component, so it doesn't help you at all. Other substance that's in the ground substance are your proteoglycans. So again, a conjugated molecule, part protein, part carbohydrate. These are very large molecules. So again, there's a core protein in the middle of them, and then there's these GAGs on the outside that kind of look like a bottle brush. These help to hold the tissues together, so more gravy-like, so thicker type, to help to form a thicker type of substance. Then the last ground substance is the adhesive glycoprotein. So again, part carbohydrate, part protein, and they just help bind your tissue together. So one particular type of connective tissue is your cartilage. Your cartilage is a structural type of connective tissue to either give shape or to help protect your bones. It's flexible, so it's stiff enough to give support, but also flexible to move when necessary. So your cartilage can be found giving shape to your ear, the tip of the nose, as well as the larynx, so the upper part of your respiratory system. So here we have a specialized type of fibroblast called a chondroblast. So again, our blast cells are our builder cells, and these cells will produce part of the matrix, so the ground substance and the fibers, to create the cartilage. So as these cells are building the matrix as well as the fibers for the cartilage, eventually as they're building around themselves, they end up getting trapped inside of the tissue material, and once they're trapped inside, then they shift and become a chondrocyte. So go from chondroblast to chondrocytes. So these cells are trapped in their own little caves called lacunae. And so you'll see this when we look at the slides, where it's literally a little hole and these cells are located in there. So surrounding a lot of your cartilage is a type of irregular connective tissue called your perichondrium. So still getting the conj part here for our cartilage tissue. Contains chondroblasts to help continue to build the cartilage and help make sure that your cartilage is growing as you grow. With your cartilage, there are no blood vessels, so in order for nutrients to be brought into that tissue, as well as waste being removed, has to rely on diffusion, so differences in concentration. Your cartilage also heals slowly because there's no blood vessels, so there's no way to bring in those nutrients into that tissue. The nutrients just have to diffuse into the cell, and so they're into the tissue, and so it's going to take a long time to heal. In your cartilage, the matrix section is rich in our glycosaminoglycans, so our GAGs, and contains your collagen fibers, helping give the strength and stretch to the cartilage. And depending on the fibers that create the cartilage, you're going to have different types of cartilage. So there's your hyaline cartilage, your fibrocartilage, and your elastic cartilage. So next type of connective tissue that's specific is our bone, so making up our skeletal system. So this type of connective tissue is what's called calcified. So there's going to be crystals that are made along the fibers that make up this type of tissue, and that's what hardens them. So the bones of the skeleton are made up of bone tissue as well as your cartilage, the marrow that's on the inside of the bone, as well as other tissue types. So there's two forms of osseous or bone tissue. You have spongy bone, which is porous in appearance. So here in our little model here, the part that's on the inside here is the spongy bone, and then the part that's on the outside is the other type, which is compact bone. For our spongy bone, again, it looks spongy, but actually it's very hard. The structures in there are our trabeculae. Your spongy bone is always going to be covered by compact bone. And this type of bone is found in the heads of your long bones as well as the middle portions of your flat bones. The other type of bone is compact bone. So on the outside of your spongy bone, it's a denser calcified tissue, very compact, no spaces in between them, more complex in the arrangement of them. And the cells and the matrix surround the blood vessels as well as nerves in, for example, your long bones. So example of this is here, where this would be spongy bone and then covered with compact bone, and so they're arranged around here where you see this little red dot is a blood vessel, and they're arranged in circles around those blood vessels that penetrate through. So if this were a long bone, this is the lengthways of it. So those blood vessels are running lengthways through it, and so the tissue surrounds it. So here's a picture of our compact bone. Our central canal that allows those blood vessels to move through the bone is right located here. Come on. Then those tissue surrounds it, built on the outside of that. The little dots that you see are the bone cells, so our osteocytes. So these osteocytes start off as our osteoblasts that will lay down the fibers and then eventually get trapped inside that bone tissue and become the osteocytes. So trapped in their own little caves. So in the structure of bone, you have these, what's called an osteon. The osteon is that whole circular structure for making up your compact bone. And then the surrounding lamellae or layers that make up that bone. Again, our osteocytes are the mature cells that are trapped in the little lacunae caves. So in order for these cells to communicate with each other, they do it through these canals called caniculi. So allowing for them to communicate with each other as well as exchange nutrients. And then all of your bone is covered by a connective tissue protecting it called the periosteum. So that's this blue on this model. That just covers your entire bone. All right, moving on to part 2.